Welcome to What's Up with Catalight, a podcast designed to raise the many important voices that are helping to shape the future for people with autism and IDDs by challenging the status quo. Your host, Dr. Lindsey Sneed, dives into the thought-provoking topics happening in the industry and at Catalight, from advocacy to research to treatment options and more. Tune in to discover how Catalight's innovative treatment options are pressuring industry-wide change and shining a spotlight on care that's shaping the landscape for individuals with developmental disabilities. This is What's Up with Catalight.
Hi, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of What's Up with Catalight. I'm your host, Dr. Lindsey Sneed, and today we're joined by Dr. Sean Inderbitzen, author of Autism and Polyvagal Terms. Sean is a clinical social worker and a nationally recognized speaker in the autism and behavioral health space who was diagnosed with autism about 30 years ago. Sean brings not only deep clinical expertise, but also powerful lived experience that really helps bridge that gap between practitioners and the communities that we're serving. Sean maintains an active practice in Wisconsin, where he's known for his highly engaging focus on autism treatment and co-occurring trauma from a body-based approach. On a personal side, Sean and I became instant friends not that long ago through LinkedIn, and I knew right away that I wanted him as a guest, so I'm really excited that he's here. Sean, welcome to the show.
Hi.
So let's jump right in on a topic you're very well versed in. So let's jump into polyvagal theory first. So I really want to jump into that because I really want our listeners to have a framework for polyvagal theory. Because when I first heard the term polyvagal theory, I was like, I am not really sure what exactly this is and what this means. And the name itself, I wasn't really resonating with it because it was really a novel term for me. But then I read your book, and your book was so insightful, and I loved it so much. And it really helped provide just so much clarity and understanding. But for our listeners who are unfamiliar, how would you describe polyvagal theory in simple terms?
Yeah, so a really simple way to think about polyvagal theory, I'm really familiar with the fancy way, but easy sort of way to think about it is it's this thing that goes up your spinal column, right, and controls our autonomic and conscious behaviors, right? So it's this construct that's like this nervous system that goes through our body. Yeah. It's the 10th cranial nerve, and it really controls a lot of our autonomic functioning, right? So think breathing, think heartbeat, think digestive tract, think eye contact, think turning our heads, right? Like when you hear a sound, right? It's like if I snap my finger, right? Or we hear a sudden motion, right? We orient towards it, right? It controls all these different functions of the autonomic nervous system and tends to correlate with feelings of safety and threat. It's kind of an easy way to think about it. So to even put it more basically, right? Like we think of three different brains, right? Think of the owl brain, which is really curious and open and expansive and exploratory and creative, right? We think of a cheetah brain, which is sort of this, I'm going to run if there's a predator, or I'm going to attack, right, if I'm trying to get dinner. And then there's possum brain, which is really this collapse system, right? Yeah. And so you can look at almost any mental health diagnosis through this lens, or almost any aspect of life, really.
Talk a little bit about the fight or flight response. So does the fight or flight response have to do with polyvagal theory?
Yeah. So, Sigmund Freud talked about fight early on in the 1900s, but really he's talking about something Darwin's talking about, which is this fight-flight response, right? It's this, what do we do in the presence of danger, right? So there's this process that's pre-conscious, right? So it's all your cognitive influence, right? Pre-thinking sort of experience of safety and threat. We call that neuroception. And so the fight-flight system really is the first line of defense when you think about that. So people tend to become more rigid in this state. They tend to do things like fist clenching, or they'll their muscles become more tense, or their blood flow goes straight to their heart, right? Because they're getting ready for a predator, right? We evolved from primate ancestors in the savannah who had to survive things like saber-toothed tigers, right? So like we have all these different beautiful biological sort of psychobiological functions that allow us to escape predators and take on prey.
So there's what you talked about too is that like there's three primary components. It sounds like so we see like fight or flight. So when we're like kind of in a position of maybe feeling threatened, either perceived or actual threat, then there's the state where we're calm and we're good. We're like ready to receive information. It sounds like the owl.
Yeah.
And then there's the possum where we're kind of explain the possum a little bit more.
So the possum is a lot. I mean, the reason I call it the possum range is it's an easy way to think about playing dead, right? Possums are incredibly skilled at playing dead. Like you can poke them, you can touch them. They will not move, right? Another framing for this is the collapse state. The technical term is the dorsal vagal state. And really, right, we think about shutdown responses. We think about lack of gaze. We think about feigning death like a possum, right? We think about dissociation or emotional numbing, right? Usually the emotions that go with this are these, unlike threat, where it's like anxiety, fear, aggression. These are less excitatory and more like collapse, sadness, depression, right? Deconstruction is sort of the word that comes to mind, but it's really this, like it's the final line of defense, right? Like when a possum's playing dead, it doesn't want to be eaten. Right. So our mammalian ancestors who used this strategy, right? This was the only strategy they had.
I'm like, as you were talking through it, I'm thinking last week was a really, really stressful week for me. I had a lot of things happen. So I can actually identify throughout the week that I had experienced all three of these states in the week. I feel like I had very stressful day on Monday and Tuesday. And so my cortisol levels were really high. I was like, if anybody said anything to me wrong, I was like ready to like fight, if you will, I was so escalated and I couldn't sleep. And then by Wednesday night, I was in a state of like so overwhelmed that actually all I wanted to do was sleep. So then I actually went to bed really early and slept like 12 hours.
Right.
And then by Thursday, I was actually doing a lot better, had processed everything I needed to process. And I was actually really able to engage, went out to dinner with some friends. And I think if my dinner plans were Tuesday or Wednesday, I wouldn't have been able to even go out with anybody.
Right. So, I mean, you just described moving from being in that cheetah brain, that sympathetic state, that fight-flight system, into dorsal state, right? You had so much stress that your body didn't know what to do with it besides shut down and sleep, right? And then Thursday, you had taken the sleep, so you were back in owl brain or ventral state, as we call it in my world.
Yeah.
But really, these things move, like they're so salient, you can see them over the course of an hour when you're doing therapy with somebody, right? Like, and then there are more rigid systems, right? So like the clients I work with tend to be either chronically post-traumatized, right? In such a way that like we're working on things like how do you not be collapsed on the job so you can be more assertive and ask for your needs and ask for accommodations, right? So that might be an example of somebody with a lot of trauma who comes into me thinking they have autism, but no, like this actually is highly dissociative. Then you have people who have autism, right? Who aren't necessarily in threat, but are more than likely, if you look at the literature, going to be in threat. And that's sort of the statistical probability. Like you're looking at a population where you have lots of medical comorbidities like lack of sleep, lack of functioning GI tract, right? So you think about the mind-gut axis, or you think about the brain-gut axis, right? You have gastrointestinal problems common in this population. You also have, I think what else? There are a ton of medical comorbidities, but all these medical comorbidities result in these distracting behaviors, as you all term them. I think behavioral state is probably a better framing for what we look at when we look at autism, when we see this rigidity and inflexibility, because really you're looking at a system sort of trapped in that those threat states, that dorsal and that sympathetic.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit more about that from the context of autism spectrum disorder. So, because in your book too, you posit this and then you explain it so well. And I'm like, as a therapist, I'm like, oh my gosh, this is so important. It's that autistic folks tend to be more in between the dorsal and what was the other term? Sympathetic state. Yeah. So they're transitioning between being like highly aroused and like in that fight or flight response or going into that shutdown mode, right?
Yeah, no, that's exactly it. And that's typical, right? This is not to say that everyone with autism is that way. It's just that more likely than not, right? The other thing, I mean, you really have to think about demographic contextual factors. If you look at the 2% of people with autism, something like 8 in 10 don't graduate college. I've seen studies ranging from 50 to 80% of people not being employed. So you think about poverty rates, right? And so you really see the bottom layer of Maslow's hierarchy of needs not getting met sometime. And then you throw on those medical comorbidities, right? You just have really stuck people. And so they do tend to have a lot of socioeconomic factors just surrounding, let alone the biological predisposition, which these studies account for, which is this really low heart rate variability, which means they have really fast hearts. And they kind of tinker between that that dorsal and that sympathetic state.
So if individuals have a resting higher heart rate, there's association with just being like at a more chronic state of stress.
Yeah, basically. I mean, there's also some long-term health impacts. There's some studies out there that guess the life expectancy difference, right? In my book, I talk about a 6-year difference in life expectancy.
Yeah.
There are studies that talk about 16-year like deficit, or it might even be 26. Some of the research gets cited a lot about autism and cardiovascular disease, right? Like life expectancy is shorter when you're autistic. So there's a statistically significant increase if you're autistic for heart failure, right? So it's like a 1.1018 increased level of risk with like a 0.05 like confidence interval with like a 95% confidence that your rate of mortality or risk for cardiovascular failure increases significantly. And that's not the only element, right, that makes people with autism more predisposed to be in this state. But I mean, you also think about the flow of sensory information, right? And how that can be really dysregulating, not in the same way as trauma, but can present in very similar ways in the body.
Yeah, there's just, I think you're speaking of heart rate, but then there's, like you said, there's so many other factors. Like we see that upwards of, studies are showing anywhere between 50 and like 90% of autistic folks have sleeping problems, right? So if you aren't getting enough sleep, that's impacting all the other areas of your life.
Right. And if you think back to Maslow, what do you need? Food, shelter, water, sleep.
Yeah.
Right.
Basic
like
need.
If you can't eat because you have some neuromuscular problem, or you have a sensitivity to taste that is not managed somehow, right? You're affecting that baseline physiological needs category.
Yes. And then you even bring into the fact that like autistic folks are more susceptible to having co-occurring like medical diagnoses, but also co-occurring mental health disorders, right? Which can further exacerbate. And like, it comes to the question of the chicken or the egg here, like as far as like having being in more and more states of like fight or flight response. Right. But I just think about like, all the co-occurring mental health conditions that the autistic population experiences. And it's like, man, it's a constant state of stress.
Right. And what I like about polyvagal theory is we can say bye-bye diagnosis altogether, right? Like, I really think if you just look at it through the lens of being human, right?
Yeah.
You can just see a person who's in a lot of threat because they're not sleeping and their mind is racing. And for me, like, that is incredibly freeing to not have to worry about the DSM. I mean, I do in my clinical work, but there are other reliable transdiagnostic ways of helping people that don't require diagnosis. And so a lot of times I'll get people who come in, I need to know my label. And it's like, why? And they're like, because then I can help myself. And it's like, or we could just work on helping you. Right. Which would be much better in terms of our use of time than what we call the thing.
That I do want to actually get into the important role, because as I was reading your book, I was thinking about my role as a diagnostician and a therapist and how this comes into play. So we're going to get into that. But first, what I wanted to get into is if you can talk about like your own journey and really what shaped your interest in polyvagal theory?
Well, so it's a bit, I like to say it's a bit of a fangled mess. I got a diagnosis at 18.
Okay.
I needed for a legal defense. That's as much as I'm going to go into it. But it worked. And so, but I had autism from a very young age and my parents had no idea. And so
Yeah.
I lived very sort of on the outliers in my family system and really did not fit in with my school mates. I didn't fit in with people I lived with, right? My family members. I always was commonly referred to as a black sheep. So, but I mean, these things translated into like in college, then I like went for social work and then I did my bachelor's in that. I married a gal. I moved to Wisconsin. I had 2 little boys, stayed in Wisconsin. We got divorced. I got my master's from Case Western Reserve and sort of moved into the Division of Vocational Rehabilitation, which I don't know what you call it in California, but really is where people are helped to find, maintain, and advance in employment, right? Because of their visible and invisible disabilities. So that was a really great sort of experience of like, what are all the services out there that the government can pay for to assist people in work and education? And so it was a really great education in that. And then I had a therapist who was like, you know what you should do? I'm like, because I had gone to school to be a policy analyst and those jobs were 4 hours away from me. And I cared more about my kids. I even got a job offer to be a policy analyst and declined it. It's just really hard. I go, I want to know what would have happened. But state service
If
was
only.
right. But I got these 2 beautiful boys who are incredible. And they're everything for me. And so my therapist was like, you could claim that you have autism and be a therapist. Like, okay. Because unlike a BCBA degree, you can do a lot with a social work degree.
Yeah.
An MSW is a lot less useful in terms of helping people and a lot more useful in terms of like doing a bajillion jobs, right?
Yeah. Yes.
And so I decided to give it a go and I've been doing it ever since. So since 2019 to now, I've been saying, yeah, I have autism. And along the way, right, I work in community mental health. And what that means is I work with whoever walks in the door. I don't get to choose my clients. My clients choose me. And so people have been coming through the door and I had a lot of trauma that I dealt with. So I got some training in sensory motor psychotherapy through the Sensory Motor Psychotherapy Institute, created by Pat Ogden and Janina Fisher. It's built on the Hakomi method, but that really exposed me to polyvagal theory because it's a body-based trauma treatment. And so from that body-based trauma treatment lens, I got familiar with polyvagal theory and I had an interest in autism simultaneously and just had enough common friends that I got an introduction to Steve. And then, you know, the rest is kind of history. And so polyvagal theory has sort of become part of my identity in a lot of ways, I would say, because it's really shaped my career formation in terms of getting my doctorate at Tulane, did work in that way. And then I did a work for the interpersonal neurobiology series. And that's significant because, I mean, prior to this book, INPB, which is like the developing mind, right? Like, which is the gold standard for how we look at child development now. And some books by Jack Pansket, right, who did some evolutionary biology work on emotions, predating all that work by the woman who did How Emotions Are Made, Lisa Feldman Barrett. Like, this is all the biological animal feeling research. And so he did a book. And so the series is just notable. And so putting an autism book in there was really important to me. And it was sort of, Steve got me in, and it was sort of like, I didn't think I stood a chance, but that editor was like, yeah, I love your writing. Let's do a book. I was like, okay. And I actually had an attorney tell me not to sign, and I did anyways. And I think it's been a really good call.
Yeah. And who is Steve for our listeners?
Stephen Porges is the originator of polyvagal theory. He's also a gentle and wonderful human being, but he's the originator of this zeitgeist theory. Like, if you go to a Barnes and Noble, there are so many books now on polyvagal theory in the self-help section and the psychology section. And he's the originator of it all back in 1994.
Okay, great. When we first started chatting, we've chatted a few times now. And I was really trying to like conceptualize what will our episode be on? Like what will be the zeitgeist, if you will, of our episode.
Sure.
And, and I read your book and I was like, okay, yes, we have to do it on your book. 'Cause I think it's so, so important. And so you wrote Autism and Polyvagal Terms for a lot of reasons, because for me, what I see is it conceptualized, these chronic states that a lot of the clients that I work with are in, and it helps really conceptualize it in a new way. And you got some legal advice not to do it. You did it anyway. And here we are. But yeah. What was talk a little bit more about your motivation in doing it? Like, was it to help therapists like myself? Like, was it to help autistic folks? Like, when you think about it, I
have a really clear mission in this way, and it sort of is a guide for a lot of discussions, whether I choose to participate in them or not. And does it increase access to mental health or not?
Yeah.
It's a really simple lens to look at how does this either increase or not increase access for mental health services to people with autism. Like, I get sort of infuriated by some of this neurodiversity, neuroaffirming stuff that I see in Psychotherapy Networker, because to me, that stuff detracts rather than like encourages people to see people with autism, right? So I've done a lot of my research I did research with Mayo Clinic, and I've done work for a number of years in working with doctors and mental health clinicians. And it's about 1 in, say, 3 and 4 is willing to, or I would go as low as 1 and 2. The data varies, right? But like, there are lots of people who won't work with people with autism. And
yes.
To me, fighting that access problem is sort of the deep motivation, because you think about it, a lot of trauma modalities, EMDR, internal family systems therapy, sensory motor psychotherapy, somatic experiencing, all these frameworks rely on polyvagal theory. So polyvagal theory gives a familiar lens to clinicians to look at autism through. And it's sort of a jump in here with us, why don't you? And to me, that's really where I want the field to move. I'm hoping my book moves it in that direction. I don't know if it will or not, but I think looking at polyvagal theory as a vehicle to allow people to look at, I already have tools and abilities, might move that third or fourth person who doesn't want to see someone with autism closer to seeing someone with autism. And it's that simple.
Yeah. There's an access issue in mental health care for autistic people. I mean, for everyone, but really it's particularly acute for autistic folks because, we hear a therapist saying like, I don't know how to work with autistic folks. It's like, I promise you do. You do know how. You have the skill set.
And then it gets more complicated too, right? Because people have the right to practice with who they want to practice with, which is why I find some of these critiques so tone deaf. Right? Like they don't have to treat somebody with autism, right? They can just say, nope, I'm out. And sometimes they do. Like, I can't tell you how many social workers who are 20 years into the field are like, we're going to cut people with autism's access to mental health services in an 11 county region kind of decisions is very consistent and common. And I think people who underestimate that really don't know anything about health and human services, because if there's a way out and the easier way to do it, they'll take it.
Something that was really, really striking to me throughout your book was the emphasis on kindness. Bringing in like a little bit of my own clinical experience with this is, there's this autistic young man that I've worked with for a while now. And, there's a lot of people who don't want to work with him because he becomes dysregulated. He can become dysregulated really easily. But we tend to have a really, really, really good relationship. And as I was reading your book and thinking about kindness, I was like mapping that onto my clinical work with him. And I was like, I'm like accepting of who he is. I'm not trying to decrease any of his stemming behavior. In fact, I'm reinforcing his stemming behavior, particularly as a means of self-regulation.
Right.
And another thing is I keep a really, really structured environment for him because that's what is most beneficial for him in thinking about like what's going to be helpful for him in the context of our interactions. And I think like there's, there's something really, I almost want to say beautiful about it because I can tell that when we're together, his caregivers are really appreciative because we have a good relationship. And other people come in and he immediately can become dysregulated. And so I've been really mapping on kindness onto that and trying to understand how kindness helps him be more in that vagal state, right?
Yep, the ventral vagus part of the nervous system.
Yeah. So can you just talk more about the role of kindness and thinking about I'm thinking about clinicians, right? My work as a clinician, like how does that come into play? How does kindness come into play here?
Everything. And I will do this with glee because the values are really what the practice is about. Like you can have all the strategy in the world, but kindness, so I was doing a talk in Chicago last year in April at PESI's 4th Autism Symposium. And one of my friends got up and someone had posed the question, like, how do I tell somebody their behaviors are actually harming them, right? Like socially. And one of my autistic friends ended up, we weren't friends at the time. We'd just begun to get to know each other, but she stood up and she's like, when people are honest with me about how I'm hurting them, it's the most helpful thing. Her name's Megan. Okay. And so she spot on the money. I think kindness is about honesty. I have a value in there about integrity, but honesty, right? Like I think there's nice and then there's kind, right? So you have like the nice guy syndrome and then there's kindness. Kindness doesn't necessarily spare feelings because I think honest, but it also like is done in the most gentle, easygoing, easy to receive kind of way. I think it's something that deeply lacks in our world these days. Like, and the only example I can give is I was hanging out with this girl in the fall and I didn't know if she liked me or not. And she was like, of course I like you. I'm like, what do you mean? Right? You're like this actual wonderful gift to the universe. And that just was super dysregulating for me. But I think it's like one of the most disarming, wonderful ways of being with people. And so when it comes to like mapping that onto interactions, like your client, right? Like people are in such a rush all the time, right? Like, and if we just slow down, begin to notice, right? Really what's happening in the present moment, and reflect and spend time in, explore the discomfort and the comfort, right? Like being kind becomes this really easy way of interacting with the world. Because it's less fast, it's less sloppy. Sometimes it's still sloppy, but you can laugh about it at the end with other people. I don't know. I think there's just a very natural way about it. I think it's one of the more important things in that book, right? Being kind to others, like giving people the respect to have difference of opinion, but to call them out. I feel like that's really important. Like I have a friend who I'm still trying to understand why this Aliens and Enemies Act, this sedition thing, his view of it being like that some people don't deserve due process is so not okay with me. And I've just, what I've come to is not to end the friendship, which a lot of people might say, go do that. Like, but I cherish this friend. But every time he's going to start making statements to me, I'm just going to be like, you lack empathy in this moment. Like, where is your empathy? Where is your heart? Like, and because we share a common faith tradition, right? So like, I have a context for it with them.
Yeah, the kindness really, 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 really resonated with me too. And I think for the reasons that you're stating, it's meeting people where they're at, by meeting people where they're at. And it can be meeting people and helping them get down to a state where they can talk to you and then like having that good relationship. And then kindness is also being honest, right? About like, by not being honest with people, it's not really helping anybody either. But you have to do it in such a way where there's a relationship established and where they're going to be able to hear it and receive it. Like there might be some defensiveness, but how can you walk through that, that whatever that honest statement is with the person who's in front of you in the way that's most meaningful for them?
I'm fully with you. I mean, think about mismatch, attach, and repair is sort of a concept out of attachment theory. I think a lot about, and I teach a lot about, is that like in any relationship, like my friend I described, who like kind of lacks empathy when it comes to this whole, we can deport people and not have any consequences about it thing. There's going to be the inevitable confrontation when it comes up, but there will also be the inevitable, hey, I care about you and I really need you to hear that, right? Like what you were saying to me is deeply unsettling because of the amount of heart it lacks for or care for other human beings, right? Like you're not connecting to that in yourself and in them. And I see that. And then I need to name that for you. And he's going to get angry at me. And when I do, it will be an experience. But we have this relational history that we talk once a week. We're consistently connected. He's not going to shut down. I'm not going to call him stupid, but like, he's going to feel it. He's really going to feel it. It's going to rattle him for a little while. And then there's this sort of, hey, like I did some reflecting and either he'll tell me he thinks I'm right or wrong, but we'll have a respectful discussion about it. We'll really get to that nuance of it. For me, I don't want to just cut somebody out of my life because they're rigid. Although, like, there is a need to stand up for people who can't stand up for themselves. There's this whole widow and orphan thing in the biblical narrative that I just can't seem to shake, no matter how far I grow. And so it's central to who I am. And so kindness is really important.
Yeah, no, I agree. And like, there's so many different applications of kindness that I could think through right now in our world. But how can like therapists, how can educators, or even parents of autistic folks, how can they use polyvagal informed approaches like really to support co-regulation and safety for autistic folks?
Well, I mean, I think we can stay right with kindness, right? Like kindness is coming at it slowly and honestly. So like if you're a parent, right, this might look like being kind to your kid when he's freaking out instead of like yelling at them for being intentionally like breaking your stuff, right? It's like, no, kid's like a wreck right now, like taking a breath, finding a moment, taking a pause, and then responding like with, hey, this is not okay. I'm not going to deal with this right now. You need to sit, you need to decompress, and then we can come back to this. And then you actually come back to it, right? Because the kind thing is not to just not repair the relationship. You actually have to do a thing to repair the alliance between the parent and child, right? That's good parenting. Good parenting comes from like to endow knowledge on, right? Like we want to actually teach, right? Discipline isn't about being punitive. It's about teaching and changing and shifting and allowing that state shift to happen. As a teacher, right? I think that's even more true, right? Kind response, right? Like you have a room full of 30 kids, right? I mean, you can really build some things in, right? Like I think having like movement, like the easy low-hanging fruit for teachers, I think is really like the low-hanging fruit of building exercise into your routines of your day, because we've been that way for I don't know how many millions of billions of years. Before the last 200 some odd years, we had compulsory education since like the 1850s to 1870s to now. It's like our biologies haven't evolved yet to this thing where you want us to all to sit and look the same. And I understand that teachers have a ton of pressure, but I don't think that takes the requirement off of them to need to be kind and think through how they teach, which, I think a lot of them do. Like I know a lot of great teachers. I've also met my handful of terrible ones. And so I tend not to do a lot with the education system and sort of sit at afar and help people process their own stuff. Because generally people are their own best advocates. There's this value in my book called organicity, which is really relying on the wisdom of the person in front of you. And like what I find when working with school systems is that parent knows what they need to say and do. They don't need me to be their advocate. They can actually be their own advocate quite well. A lot of times what they need to do is get unstuck in their own stuff about their kid, or the kid needs to get unstuck to be able to ask for what they need, right? And so the role of therapists, I think, And maybe it's different for behavioral analysts versus psychotherapists, is really applying neural exercises through the values of autism and polyvagal terms like kindness, like organicity, like whether it's you're dealing with rigid behaviors, right? So these restrictive, repetitive patterns of interest and behavior that are harmful to them and others, right? Through things like exercise, mindfulness, motivational interviewing, or really allowing that social engagement to spontaneously emerge as people like arrive at their own solutions and they feel safe and they feel calm, or you're using somatic interventions if you don't have apraxia at play. And so to me, that's how it maps out, is really you have to map the values out like you're talking about, and then you apply the tools.
The exercise piece, that was actually when I was reading through that component of your book, I was like, oh my gosh, yes, this is so important. And recently, Sean, I've started giving more recommendations around exercise for the clients that I'm working with, just like thinking through how important it is. And I was talking to a caregiver who has an adult son who's autistic, but also has co-occurring intellectual disability.
Yep.
And we were talking about his aggression and what that looks like, and when it happens versus when it doesn't happen. And not to say like exercise is the be all end all by any means, because I don't think that's the case. But I think for him in particular, exercise would definitely help.
Right, because you're flipping the vagal switch, right? You're building vagal efficiency. You're moving the body out of threat and into safety. And you have to do it over and over and over again. I don't know. I think that's positive reinforcement is your word for it over in ABA land. But really what you're telling him to do is essentially flip his vagal switch. You're teaching that caregiver to do that, right? And you can do it. And now everybody has things like Apple Watches. I hold my hand up as if I have one. I don't. I never plan on getting one. But still, I have some clients who are intellectually disabled and adults, and they'll set their BPM. We'll look at their age and their weight. We'll look at their age and we'll say, what are your standard? And so, like, if they're 70, right, and it's 60 to 100 is a healthy rate, I might have them set it at like 85, 90. So every time it sets, it like reminds them to take a breath, or you can set it to remind you to exercise, right? Because really neural exercises have to be repeated to be effective. That's how you come out of the state of threat and you stay out of it, right? Because autism is sticky, is the word I think people use to describe it in academic circles. But it can change and does change. And I see it all the time.
Yeah. And for this family in particular, again, like, not that exercise was the be all end all. There's a lot of different things, but it really did help.
Right.
Because it brought things down for him. And it really just helps with this, like, to be able to be successful in other aspects of how we're supporting this family and their son. Right. So like I said, I loved your book. It was really easy as a clinician to apply to my clinical practice. But where can listeners learn more about you and grab your book, and what's next for you in this space?
Actually, there's a lot next. People can learn more about me on Instagram at Inderbitzen Consulting Services. I think you'll put it in the show notes. I think you have the tag. So we'll be tagged in it. But you can book an appointment with me. I do consultations nationally. And so people can choose a half-hour increment, a 3-hour increment, or not a 3-hour, an hour increment, or you can get
I was like, that's a long time, Sean.
Well, some people choose to do 3 sessions with me at once. And so then they get a discount of like $70 per hour by bundling 3. So you can book through Square on my Instagram if you want to learn more about me, or you can read my book at any major retailer. As far as what's next, are you talking like next books? Are you talking next talks? Are you talking credentials? What are we thinking?
Yeah, like next books.
Okay, so I'm working on a self-help book for autistic adults right now. I'm still developing it, but should be out later this year, I think, if I remember right. It's pretty close to done, or just doing some final touches on it, but it really takes on this question of autism and identity, looking at it through sort of a parts lens rather than an Ericksonian, like, this is who I am, right? Like, it's more of a, like, yourself is not monolithic, it's parts. how does that map onto being autistic? And so that is really the next work for me. So I'm speaking at Unite next week. They're having a talk. People can come check out for free. It's 2 hours, it's 10 to 12 Eastern Standard Time on the 10th. I'm doing some talks and doing the Autism Symposium for PESI in May. I'm going to be lecturing with Deb Dana, who is another one of these polyvagal theory people. And then I'll be doing a lecture with Bonnie Goldstein from Sensory Motor Psychotherapy Institute's faculty over there. And then I'll be doing a lecture in Brazil too. And so Brazil is sort of the next space for my book as far as things go. And then I'm also working on a manual for applied neural exercises and some research around that. Perhaps depending on the granting agency and if we find the researcher we like.
So you have just a little bit going on.
Just a little.
Just a little bit.
Just a tad.
Well, Sean, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your perspective and your passion. Your work has truly inspired me, and I hope everyone listening feels the same. I'm really glad that we were able to connect on LinkedIn first, but then especially today. I really, really appreciate what you're doing.
I'm so glad. I was a joy to be here with your audience and hanging out with you because I think you're doing good stuff.
Thanks, Sean. So to all of our listeners, thank you for tuning in to another episode of What's Up with Catalight. If you enjoyed our conversation, be sure to subscribe, leave us a review, and share this episode with your colleague and community. Talk to you soon.
This has been What's Up with Catalight, hosted by Dr. Lindsey Sneed. Now you know what's up with Catalight.